Welcome and thank you all for joining us today on our first webinar, Asset Management Introduction and Encouragement with Ruth Wallsgrove, part of the AMCL USA webinar series. My name is Andres Nova, your moderator. Due to the amount of attendees today, we'll be answering key questions at the end of this presentation. Please type your questions in the question box. If we are unable to answer your questions due to time restraints, we'll answer the rest by email after the presentation. I will now hand it over to Ruth.
Great. Thank you very much, Andres. Okay, welcome everybody to this first of our webinar series. This is going to be a short introduction to asset management, but I want it to be more than a typical, this is what asset management, this is how you do it. This is really also to encourage everybody on how important it is and how, with each other's lessons learned and support, how we can make a huge difference to our organizations. So, we've done that one already. I work for AMCL USA, and we're a dedicated asset management consultancy around the world. That's all we do with asset management, and we work with a wide range of sectors, but in particular with infrastructure. We've been working in the USA since about 2012, and I am most of the time, not now, I work in the USA and particularly on the West Coast. So we work with a whole huge range of organizations from very large to very small in 5 continents across the world. My job is as Director of Training for AMCL USA. I've built an asset management team myself in Australia, and I was involved as a director of the Institute of Asset Management with the first national asset management standard, PAS 35. I now mostly work in the US with a range of different organizations supporting their journey to asset management. I also co-wrote a guide to building an asset management team that's available from us. So I'll give you the details at the end. Okay, so what I want to cover today is looking at what is asset management really? What does it mean in practice in the 30 years since it was started in Australia? I also want to talk about what we've all learned collectively about what it actually takes to make it work. And there's a lot of experience across different sectors, and we really believe in making sure that we share this good practice around the world and across different sectors. I'm then going to talk a little bit about what we see as practical steps, especially if you're starting out. There's bound to be a question of where do you start, but hopefully this is also useful even if you're not starting out. And then we've got some extra resources to suggest at the end to support you. As Andres said, we will come to questions. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions. We'll pick out representative questions. If we run out of time, we will then follow up with you afterwards. So, okay, so what is asset management really? I really like to put this in some historical context. People often ask, what's the difference between what we've always been doing and this new thing called asset management, which I think is a fair question, because we've been managing physical assets for thousands of years, and we've got pretty good at it. We have very good people, often of frontline operations and maintenance engineering, who know an awful lot about their assets, who do good things every single day. We've got a lot of knowledge about our assets and a lot of good processes. What we have are that we can make sure that our service is working. If we didn't make sure our service is working every day, we wouldn't still be in business. So we know that we can make it all work. We've put a lot of work into working out what assets cost up front, not just what do they cost to buy, but what does it cost to construct, especially complex projects. We've got a lot of, we say local expertise, but we don't just mean physically locally, but also specialist knowledge that's absolutely invaluable. And a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people have got something more structured than just run the assets till they fail and then do something about it, particularly using age to say, as our assets age and they wear out, we have more systematic ways of saying, okay, they're wearing out, we need to replace them. So we don't just wait until they fail. And I think the last thing is that we are very good if something goes wrong. Most of our organisations are very, very good at going out and fixing it in a hurry. We're really very good at that. And all of these things have to continue. Nothing about modern asset management suddenly makes any of those any less important. But I think about asset management, it's on top of what we've always done rather than instead of it. And in particular, I think there are three things. First of all, that we're trying to look longer term with integrated planning into 5, 10, 20 beyond years. We're also trying to look across the whole life cycle, so all the costs and the interactions between the life cycle phases. And we're trying to look across asset systems so that instead of focusing on individual assets with their own experts, looking at what that means for the whole system. So it's also trying to be on the front foot rather than on the back foot. We need our emergency responses, but we don't always want to be responding in an emergency. So asset management is an addition to what we've always done. Here is a useful definition that I'd like to share with you. This is based on the British National Standard PAS 55 that came out in 2004. And I like the definition because it really captures some of the key concepts of asset management in quite a neat, short definition. So I'm going to go through that fairly quickly, but all of these words I think are absolutely vital to asset management. The first is that it's optimal. And that is, it's not lowest cost, it's not highest performance, it's not least risk, let alone zero risk. No, instead, it's the optimal balance of cost, risk, and performance. Clearly, that's more complicated than just looking at one of these factors. But in the 21st century, we can't afford to only look at cost and not look at safety, or only look at safety and not look at cost. And we always have to be thinking about performance. So asset management is really about how we get that right balance. One thing about that is that it changes over time and it depends on where you are, where the asset is. So it's a bit of a dynamic balancing act. The second key concept there is life cycle. Now, of course, I'm sure you all know what the life cycle is, but here what it's standing for, I think, is two things. First of all, that we have all the phases of the life cycle, and if you're in one phase of the life cycle, you have to be thinking about what happens next. What are you handing on to the next phases of the life cycle? So you always, wherever you are, you're always thinking about what this is going to look like until we get rid of the asset at the end. And the second thing about it is really thinking about how long should we keep an asset? What life cycle thinking is also around how long should we keep an asset? We'll talk a little bit about thinking about all the costs across the life cycle, which is a very good way of doing it. Now, what I'm talking about is the management of physical assets. ISO 55000, the international standard, does have slightly wider ambitions, that it might include anything that's an asset to your organization, like people or finance. I think it's probably safer that we stick with physical assets because that's kind of our expertise in the asset world. But when I talk about physical assets, I mean both the operational assets, the pipes and wires and treatment works and trains, all that deliver service to the customers, which of course is why they're there. But we also have to think very carefully about how to manage the secondary assets, the assets that allow us to keep the primary assets still working, the service centres, our trucks, our maintenance tools, the IT. So the scope here is essentially all physical assets that we need in order to deliver service not only now, but into the future. There's one addition that I probably would add here, which is asset information, because not only is it absolutely essential for making good decisions, it does need active management. And in my experience, if it's not involved in asset management, it doesn't really get managed. In other words, the people who are making decisions are the people who most care that the information is there to make those decisions. The next key word here is sustainably, and that's another absolutely key concept in asset management, that our job is not just have assets working today. Our job, especially if we're asset management practitioners, is to be doing what we can to make sure that they'll still be working in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, even 50 years for long life assets, and that we're not handing on any unacceptable burdens of debt or future costs or risks to the people who come after us. I think this is absolutely essential. We're stewards for the assets over the short, medium, and long term. And then all of this management of physical assets is to deliver the business objectives. When I first read that, I thought, that's obvious. We exist to further the objectives of the company that employs us. But it turns out to make sure that all the decisions we make on assets really do add up to what we want them to, that is our organizational goals and targets, is probably the single most difficult thing in asset management. And the bigger the organization, of course, the more this is going to have to take coordination. So let's just have a look at a couple of those quickly. First of all, I think there's a question of, it's not whether you could keep an asset longer, meaning could you kind of stretch it out by a bit of sealing wax and string, but whether you should. The idea that there is actually an optimum time to keep an asset, and that's often long before it actually falls apart in a heap of rust. In fact, by the time many assets actually finally fail, you may well have gone beyond the optimum time. And that's because as they start to fail, their costs and their risks go up, they start to impact on customers, and all of those things start to actually cost us. So it's like there's a U-shape. You keep the asset for an optimal time. If you keep it too long, you'll start to be paying out more. And this is a really important concept. It's not just about keeping assets for as long as we can. And just an allied thought here is about sustainable, which is not putting off things that will give us problems in the end. So I like to use the example of bridges. It can't be said of bridges that we don't know how to manage them. We've had bridges for thousands of years, and we know what it takes to manage a bridge, which is basically to keep inspecting and doing remediation and refurbishment if we find any problems. So the interesting question comes, how do we end up in North America with so many road bridges in terrible condition, really at risk of failing? And we can't say either that if a bridge fails, nobody cares. If a bridge falls in the river at rush hour, you certainly do care. So the question is, how have we got to the point that our bridges are in such bad condition? And I think this is a classic thing of unsustainable management of bridges. I'd like to think of the implausible story that maybe top management have a need to save cash this year. So they're thinking, what can we cut? Quite often they think, the first thing they think of cutting is maintenance, which is a problem in itself. And so that somebody gets a good idea, go to the bridge engineers and ask them if we could put off doing any bridge maintenance for a year. And if you go to bridge engineers and say, could we put off doing much maintenance? They won't be happy about it, but they'll probably say, we can probably get away with it. If we don't do any much work this year, we can probably get away with it as long as we do it later. So, and again, I hope you don't know what I'm talking about. At the end of that year, when we haven't spent any money on bridge maintenance, nothing's happened. Nothing's happened to the bridges. Nothing's fallen off. Nobody's fallen off the bridge. And okay, nothing happened. We didn't spend any money. Nothing happened. Can we do it again? And you go back to the bridge engineers, and a little more unhappily this time, they go, maybe we could put it off for another year. And before you know it, it's not a line item in the budget. Everybody's forgotten, apart from the bridge engineers, that there was ever an issue. You put off, you put off, you put off, and you put off doing the bridge maintenance. And then one day it's too late. It falls in the river at rush hour, and now you're very, very sorry. And this is a great example where we're just not thinking ahead. What might be a short-term saving turns out to be a long-term disaster. It's particularly prevalent with very long life assets. Okay, so sustainably is best defined as the opposite of that. Little and often keeping on top of the problems on a road, on a bridge, on a structure, on anything, so that we know that it's going to work, not just now, but into the future. Okay, so if that's a very quick run through what is asset management, what does it actually take in practice to do these decisions? I want to just briefly look at ISO 55000, which is the international standard on asset management that came out in 2014. Now, I'm a real fan of ISO 55000. It doesn't tell you how to do things. That's not its idea. What it is a fantastic framework, like a checklist of all the things you need to worry about if you're really going to manage your assets optimally. So it's a very impressive document written by representatives of 29 different countries. So it's a really good consensus view of what's important from around the world from very different sectors. The definition doesn't quite do it for me because it's a bit general. But there's one word in that definition that is completely fundamental to asset management, and that's the word coordinated. Because if asset management is generally about making good decisions, and we're wanting to coordinate, we want them to all pull together in the same direction. It's not about individual decisions. We've got lots of clever people with lots of knowledge and lots of experience who can make good individual decisions. But asset management isn't about that. Asset management is making sure that all those decisions pull together to deliver what we need, including, of course, sometimes not doing something we might have thought of doing. And as soon as you put it like that it's coordinating decisions, it's obvious that it's not purely a technical issue. It's also a people issue, how people share, we get the people around the table, we see things across different departments. So coordination is a very key point of asset management. And that's because, in the end of the day, what asset management was really defined as being was delivering an integrated, longer-term plan for all the things we're going to do to our assets to make sure that they will still be delivering the service to customers we want them to in 10 years' time. That was the original asset management question. What will we have to spend over the next 10 years to make sure that we will, say, maintain our level of service to customers? And a moment's reflection, if we want a 10-year plan that covers all of our assets and takes everything into account, it's clear that it also must involve a huge range of our teams. It's very difficult in an infrastructure organisation like water or power or roads to think of any department that doesn't need to be at the table when we're looking at planning. So it's mostly about coordinating, facilitating all the right inputs from everybody, not just engineers and finance, but people who know about customer service and future demand. All of those people and more we need to be in one process. I mean, the opposite of an integrated plan is obviously a disintegrated plan where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand does. And if you've got lots of different plans all over the place, sooner rather than later, you'll trip each other up. Optimizing means it must be integrated. I think it's also true that it isn't really a document, although some things like transit have to deliver a plan. It isn't so much the plan itself, but the process, the integrated planning process that's so essential for our organisations. And that's because out of this, we get all kinds of things. It might be a general rate case, our capital programme, that's obvious. But it also, we need to think about what's the maintenance we need to do for the next 10 years. And if we're doing all of this, and especially if we've got assets which it's very difficult to access for all sorts of reasons, safety and otherwise, in parallel, we have to be thinking about when are we taking assets out to do the work. Because downtime, access to the assets, can be the single most scarce resource in many, many sectors. But it's more than even just the programs of what we're going to do. It's also an input to HR. If we know this is the capital program we're going to do and this is the maintenance we need to do over the next 10 years, you can very easily turn that into, and this is what we need in internal resources and external resources. So we can say, if this is the maintenance I need for the next 10 years, this is the number of full-time equivalent staff we need. It's an input to HR planning, which I have to say in my experience, they're usually very grateful for. It's also an input to the budgeting. And best practice asset management doesn't start with a budget and work out what we can do with it, but it works out what we need to do to deliver service to customers at an affordable rate, and then works out what that'll cost us. And it forms the basis of the budgeting. In advanced asset management organisations, they do the asset management plan comes first and the budget follows. And it's also, of course, true that if we know what we're going to be doing in the next 10 years, we know what materials and equipment we can buy, and procurement can get a good deal with the market. The only warning I give on this, all of this is very, very good news, and it's just a job of work. It doesn't require anything really above thinking, what are we trying to achieve? But in the longer run, we will have to answer the obvious question. Somebody might give us money to do this capital program, say, here's a list of capital projects we want to do, and this is why we want to do them, and everybody's fine. Sooner or later, somebody's going to say, I'm not that interested in the list of projects. What I'm really interested in is what level of service this is going to give the customers, at what kind of risk level, and what overall status of the assets and condition terms. So sooner or later, we have to relate the things we're going to do to assets with what they are going to deliver. And I think that's one of the nice challenges in asset management, to get that relationship between what we do and what it costs and what that delivers in terms of performance, condition and risk. Okay, so that's the heart, cheesy, I know. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. Hopefully some of you might have come across it. Very, very useful diagram that's used around the world that captures, it's not an organizational structure. What it is capturing the different things you have to worry about. If you're going to manage your assets really well, here are the things you need to think about. Starting with the fact that, of course, we have external stakeholders, customers, regulators, owners, etc., who all want different things. Top management, that's the technical term, the executive, whose job it is, out of all these competing requirements, work out what the strategy is going to be for the company and what the targets are going to be, what level of service, what budgets, etc. Now, if you remember, the original definition said that asset management is about delivering these objectives. We can turn that around and say that that's therefore what drives us. It's our organizational goals and targets that are driving the rest of us in asset space. And this is often called the six-box model, mostly because it has roughly 6 boxes in the scope of asset management. Very quickly to go through it if you've not seen it. Of course, there are all the activities we actually do on the assets, all the people designing, project managing, operating and maintaining the assets. Asset management isn't, funnily enough, isn't actually that preoccupied with how they do that. And that's because, in general terms, we do it okay. Our ops know how to operate, our maintainers know how to maintain, our engineers know how to design. And if they didn't, we'd be in trouble. We'd have a problem, but we wouldn't call it asset management. No, asset management's not really about the how we do delivery to the assets. It's really what we ask them to do in the first place, the what on the assets rather than how to do it. And that means that asset management is really here. It's about the decision making, which one problem we have if you're a very big organization is that you have you may have thousands or millions of assets, hundreds or thousands of people working on those assets, making decisions every day. You've got decisions about assets being made at every level in the organization. The problem is if we want all those decisions to really pull together to deliver the targets that were set above, this is quite a complicated job. I mean, I have worked with people who only had 5 assets, and I have to say they're very happy people, I mean, their total system. Because if you've only got 5 assets, it's very easy to see how it all adds up. If you've got 100,000 assets, it's a different job again. And in fact, to make good decisions, we have to put it within a framework that will allow us to coordinate. And this framework, the framework really of asset management, is described as strategy and planning. Planning we've talked about already, the integrated coordinating plan that should be for 10 years, but at least 5 years. And then discovering that if we didn't have good strategy, we couldn't have good plans. Don't be frightened of the word strategy. We're not talking business strategy or some sort of very economic strategy. We're talking about strategy for our assets. And this is really just a matter of standing back, not just doing what we've always done because we've always done it, but actually consciously getting the right people around the table to say, how do we want to manage our assets going forward? And those asset strategies then support us in doing a good plan. So this is really what asset management is. To go back to the previous section, this is really what it's all about. However, obviously, we can't make good decisions unless we've got a few other things in place. First and foremost, most obviously, is the right information. This is not just another way to say data and IT, because this asset information also includes experience and knowledge of our experienced and knowledgeable people. It's really a knowledge-based discipline, supported by data when we've got it. But don't make the mistake of thinking that we are, in my working lifetime anyway, and probably yours, ever going to have so much data we can just have a big black box and it's going to make the decisions for us. Decisions are still made by people, but supported by good data and good IT. Now, I am not too fussed about asset information. I've been working in it for, I guess, about 25 years. And I think we know in the world what information we need to make good decisions. Much more problematic, really, than the data is that it involves people. That's always going to be the most complicated part of any system, is the people. And there are a few different issues we have to think about with people. Just two I'm going to mention is, first of all, we have to have the right people with the right skills and the right jobs, of course. But secondly, we have to have the right attitudes. And for me, two key attitudes in asset management, well, you could probably guess them from what I've said already. One of them is the willingness to work together, to share knowledge, and also to ask questions, to understand who else in your organization knows things you don't know, and to get them involved. So that process, that culture of working together, I'm afraid there's no alternative. We don't collaborate, we don't have optimal asset management. And secondly, again, from really the definition of asset management, is we have to have a culture of thinking more than short term. If we have a very aggressively short term view in our organizations, we'll never do optimal asset management. It might look all right for a time, but it's not going to look good in the long term. So it's not just a matter of the right skills, it's a matter of the right attitudes. On the other side, now risk is, I have a slight problem, and I think the person who wrote this diagram is actually on this webinar, which is kind of interesting. Risk isn't really in a box on its own. Risk is really everywhere. And that's partly because we are looking into the future, both short, medium, and long term, planning for the future. And the one thing you know for sure about the future is it's uncertain. And with uncertainty, we have to make good use of risk management and risk thinking. We never know enough because we're looking into the future. And you know that risk, we have to think about risk every time we go on site, every time we make a decision, every time we think about strategy. So risk is really everywhere in this diagram. It's wishful thinking to think it's somebody else's problem. It's not, it's our problem. And the last bit is partly because our asset systems are complex and partly because things are changing. We never understand the systems as much as we'd like to. And of course, there's new things coming along all the time, new technologies, but also new context. It's a continuous learning process of asset management. And that means something called a plan, do, check, act loop. Basically, if you don't keep learning, you'll fall behind with assets. And we have to build that into the way we think. That is, every time we have a plan and we go and deliver it, we have to go and ask explicitly, did it deliver what we wanted? If not, we have to go back and change our assumptions. And of course, if it did deliver what we want, then we want to go back and reinforce it. So that's the 6-box model. It's very useful for thinking about, you don't get a choice to leave out some of these boxes. Just to talk a little bit more about decision making, just to say that, of course, we don't make all the decisions as asset management practitioners. Top management makes the decisions on things like capital program. If they're clear about what they want us to deliver, our job as asset management people is to deliver them the evidence, the options, the implications in a form that actually supports them in making better decisions. So even though we might have some issues sometimes that it's not clear what their priorities are, our number one job is actually to make sure that we are thinking actively how to get the right information to top management to make those decisions in an accessible way. That's kind of a big part of what we need to do as asset managers. It takes commitment from the top. There's quite a lot to be said about this. And one way we do that is through something called an asset management policy or asset management commitment, to work with top management on getting them to actively sign up to, here are the principles we want to use going forward. Aspirational, they'll always be aspirational. We aren't there yet, but this is what we're trying to build through an asset management organisation. Touched on already that we need to think about the whole life cycle, and there is a particular cultural challenge for us, which is the people who make the decisions at the beginning of the life cycle who have a disproportional impact on the overall life cycle. We make a poor decision at the front, everybody will be living with that decision for the rest of the time we have that asset. So it's not operations and maintenance who need necessarily to be taught about asset management. It's also the people up front, including the people, the planners, the engineers, the project managers. Because as we go through, we're locking in both the costs and the risks. This is a big concept in asset management, is you can't make these decisions in isolation at the beginning. So here's just a few costs. One problem we have is that most organizations in the world don't track operating and maintenance costs. And often they're very high, so it's not just a matter that they're too small to be noticeable. It's another issue here is that we have to start including risk. What's the cost to our organization if the asset fails? Because we can't exclude that, because it's actually the risk of our assets failing, especially in quite serious ways, which really drives us to think that we shouldn't leave our assets to run to failure. So we have to start including that in our costs. All right, and then this is overall our view of asset management. It's time traveling. It's about planning for the future, even if that's next week, based on a good understanding of where our assets are now, and making best use of experience and data from the past. And above all, keep learning, continually learning and improving. So risk is about uncertainty. It's also about objectives. So again, it's tying us back to everything points to understanding what we're trying to achieve as an organization. A problem, obviously, for asset people is that a physical asset going wrong can impact on almost every goal that your organization has. So when we talk about asset risk, it's not just safety. It can impact on anything we care about. Balancing cost, risk, and performance. I've said already that this is what we have to do. We don't have a choice. It's not because I'm standing here and telling you you need to do it. But that does mean a more dynamic approach to the right decision. I'm not saying that every single time we do something, we have to make a complicated decision about it, just to understand that the right trade-off for an asset may depend on where it is and how old it is, and that means that one size doesn't fit all in general for asset decisions. And lastly, I just want to say in this section that for me, information is important, but it's only important in how it supports us making better decisions. And therefore, we should start at least to think about not so much what data can we collect or what IT can we buy, but to start with what decisions do we need to make about our assets, how we want to make them, and then work from there down to what that means in terms of our information. Information is very expensive, and it's very expensive if you get it wrong. Okay, so if that's kind of what it takes, what are the steps to get there? I wanted to talk briefly about historically, if we look in the 30 years of asset management, well, how have people gone about it? Very often, people have not known when they started on this journey exactly what assets they have. And so quite logically, they think, right, let's find out what assets we have and then start to try and understand that. Because once we know what we have, then of course we can use that understanding of our entire asset portfolio as a basis for good longer term planning. And then that planning, hopefully, over time, gets better and better as we build in optimization, not just for capital, not just for maintenance, but for everything. Good risk-based decisions for all our assets and all the things we do on it. So that makes a kind of handy 3 steps. However, I think the problem, perhaps historically for some of us, is that focus on trying to get the data in the first place could sometimes turn out to be a trap, because before you know what you're going to do with the data, you don't really know what data to collect. So I would say now, my advice to people is don't necessarily rush off into collecting the data and buying the work management or enterprise asset management system, because the people who did it best over time are people who stopped and said, what are we actually going to do with that information when we've got it? What are we really doing in asset management? So here, really to finish on, is just to say, instead of starting throwing money at data and IT, which is very tempting because we can get on and do with it, this is what I would suggest. Actually, the very first thing we need to do if we're going to do asset management is First of all, make sure that we understand what's good practice in the world and we learn what we can from other organisations before we start trying to apply it in our own. And that as soon as we get a good idea of what we need to do and how we're going to do it, communicate, communicate, communicate. So the one thing you will see in every good practice asset management roadmap is there's a long, long line that says we're always communicating, because we're trying to change the way people think about things, and that doesn't happen without communication. And then just to go through some other obvious steps, it's a very good way to start by where are we? And where are we compared to other organisations in our sector or across the world? A sort of benchmarking, really. And then once we've worked out where we are and where we want to be, we need to kind of capture that in a strategy. So that's, of course, in ISO 55000 called a strategic asset management plan. It's a high-level strategy that says, why are we doing asset management? What are the real challenges in our organisation that asset management actually has to answer? And then focusing what we do on those issues. Then, of course, as soon as we can, we need to start picking up the planning we're already doing and start thinking, how are we going to make this, remember, integrated across our systems through time? So how are we going to make sure we cover all our assets in an integrated plan, 5+ years, build on what we have to start putting that integrated plan in place, because that's really what the whole point is. And to support that, then think about our asset strategies, think about risk and how we put in a framework, understanding our costs, and on the back of that, have our asset information strategy. All right, so that's pretty quick. The asset management journey, this comes from London Underground originally, which is basically saying we're all on a journey. Most people here will not be at either end of this. ISO 55000 is a fantastically good milestone, but you'll see it's only really considered competent. It's not considered excellent or optimized. It's a framework on which you can start to build this optimization. So I thought it was worth throwing in a slide in the last 3 minutes here. What does an asset management practitioner actually do for a living? Because I think there's a bit of confusion, or perhaps there's just not much actually said. Lots of things about what asset management is, but not what an asset manager does. And I think my view here is that really an asset manager, if you are called an asset manager, there are 3 things that you have to do, not little, by the way. First of all, is the number one thing is to get that integrated asset management planning process going, whatever it takes, and all the supporting things you need about cost, risk, strategy. Secondly, you need to be project managing, putting in that framework to make sure we're not missing anything out. Now, you could be taking it to ISO 55000 compliance or certification. You don't need to, but you do need that system or framework, because otherwise it's all piecemeal still. And third, and by no means least, is that you have to be spearheading the change of that culture to alignment, collaboration, system, and long-term thinking. And above all, the motto of an asset management practitioner might be always asking the question, and then what? And then what happens? Okay, benefits, I'm not going to go through. I might come back to, I have started to use, instead of all the great things that happen. I mean, if you're good at asset management, good things will happen to your organisation. But I'm also quite tempted to remind people of what happens if you don't do asset management. You might come back that if you don't do good asset management, exactly, this is a whole, I call them stupidity stories, which is how do very smart, knowledgeable people do very, very expensive mistakes if it's not all joined up. Why is it worth the effort? Just to finish, well, name your problem. If you've got a better run organisation, it was proved a long time ago that that has a big impact on things like share price. So better asset management means a better run organisation, which will probably impact on your share price and your profitability and all the things that the board really cares about. Asset management means proactively managing risk. Lower insurance premiums, anybody? The insurance industry thinks so. It means better relationships with regulators and funders. And a warning to any of you who haven't already come across this is that in the end, regulators and funders absolutely love asset management planning. If you're not required to do one legally already, you will be soon. Okay, and less stupidity stories. So shall we talk about some stupidity stories for a minute? I think I can't remember a time in asset management when people weren't telling me stupidity stories. We share them. How things with uncoordination and no integrated planning, how do we manage to trip each other up? But a really good story to start here is a more recent one. So I don't know whether people remember in the press a few years back where the French rail company managed to specify and order a new passenger train fleet that when it arrived, it didn't fit on the tracks. In other words, the gauge wasn't right. It was their tracks. It wasn't somebody else's tracks. Now, you can imagine how red-faced they were and how much the rest of us laughed, especially if we knew anything about trains, ordering a train fleet that doesn't fit on the tracks. It becomes slightly less amusing when you realize how many train companies in the world, I'm not picking on transit in particular, but how many train companies in the world have done the same thing. Maybe not that the gauge of the wheels wasn't right, but they bought trains that wouldn't go through their tunnels or wouldn't go around their curves or wouldn't fit in their service bays. And it's almost a given that a new train fleet won't fit in their washing bays. It was always in Britain. It was always if I ever worked with electrical engineers in railways, they were always bemoaning the fact that every time they order a new train fleet, they don't think to check with electrical engineers whether the traction supply can actually supply enough power for trains that are bound to be heavier because, okay, you get the idea. So we've got lots of stories. My favourite one is that a train maintenance vehicle which wouldn't fit through the stations. I mean, it fit on the track and it went through the tunnels, but it wouldn't go through the stations. And when the asset management team went to look on earth what's gone wrong, it was because they'd used as designed clearances instead of as built clearances at the stations. If you don't know why, that makes such a particularly good asset management story. Okay, now I picked on trains, but every sector has things. They're basically what happens when you don't coordinate. We all run complex systems which require a lot of active coordination. And I don't just mean in the operating, but also in how we construct and design them and how we maintain them every day. So, stupidity stories. We'll have less of them. We'll manage risk. We'll have better relationships and, of course, happy customers. And the last thing I really want to say in the formal part of the presentation is that asset management, look, it does take work. In fact, actually, I'm very into that at the moment. It doesn't happen by magic. A half-time person who doesn't know much about asset management is going to have a really hard time transforming an entire organization. It's just the way it is. But it takes the skills, knowing what asset management's about and learning the lessons from everybody else. It takes real work. It takes commitment from the top. What it doesn't require is millions of dollars. So it's not a matter of writing out a big check. It's more about making sure we have the skills, putting in the dedicated effort, and getting the commitment from the top. Okay, so that's mostly what I wanted to say formally, and just to say that if I'm not going to show it right now, but if you haven't ever seen it, there is a really brilliant cartoon from the Institute of Asset Management called The Big Picture, which mostly focuses on the whole issue of coordination and people. And it's very amusing. I mean, apart from the fact the guy has a funny accent like mine. It's very, very good. So here are some resources we can suggest. The Institute of Asset Management, of course. You can see The Big Picture on YouTube. Get in contact with us, and we can put you in contact with other people. And we've got some other webinars. If you're not already registered for those, please do. And of course, above all, the most important resource available to an asset management practitioner is other asset management practitioners. So I see the most spectacular results in somewhere like the USA, where people are plugged into networks of other organizations, and they can really share their developments and their thoughts and their data and their tools. And that way you can, I think that for me, it's always leapfrogging, using what other people have learned. You can even move faster, ahead faster than them, and maybe even overtake them. So each other is the most important resource we have. Okay, so just to say that we also we're offering, we will give you the link for this when we follow up email. We have got a free 10-minute survey to assess your maturity. If you haven't tried this using the 6-box model, it's a good starting point for seeing where is your organisation. So we'll send you the link for that. Okay, so do we have any questions? Andres?
Well, a lot of people are asking if this presentation is going to be available for them to watch it on their own time. So that's a yes to that.
Yeah, that's a very easy question to answer. The answer is yes, obviously. So anybody who registered for this webinar will get a link to even if people who couldn't attend will get a link to the recording of this. So I guess we should be glad that people might want to listen to it again. Do we have any questions about doing asset management?
And if we have a raised hand.
So do you want to, do I have to do, hang on a sec. Let me just have a look at that.
If you want to type your questions on the question box, I can read it for you. We have a question here from Shaminda. How do we do the life cycle costs?
Right. What a good question. I like this question because do you remember that I said that what turns out to be the most difficult thing in asset management sounds like the most obvious, that everything we do with our assets all has to add up to what our organizations require. You know, what are the top goals and targets? So something that looks straightforward turns out to be very difficult. The nice thing about whole life costs is it's completely the opposite, that it looks complicated, but is actually very easy to do. Now, I haven't probably got enough time on this webinar to talk you through it, although it's a kind of 10-minute job. Actually, don't be frightened of whole life costs, because there are certainly people on this webinar who've done it very successfully without finding actually it's less work than you think. The thing that trips us up is that we may not collect our operating maintenance costs in our finance system, and that's a problem. But of course, we know what our operating and maintenance costs are if we talk to the people who are doing operations and maintenance. So actually, if you get the right people around the table who know what work we do, because it's not a finance model, it's essentially a model of what work do we do with our assets over their lives. If you get the right people around the table, it takes, I don't know, 15 minutes to come up with a starting point of a whole life cost model. It's partly because any given asset tends to have a certain combination of costs. So once you've got one transformer, you know what other transformer is going to look like. Once you've got one railway carriage, you know really what another railway carriage is going to look like. So although I can't go into details exactly how to do it, and clearly we can talk more offline. Whole life costs turn out to be something that's not that hard to do, and they are so useful. It's almost like we kind of know the bits. There's a kind of theme here. We know the bits of a whole life cost model. The real benefit is when we bring them all together and we can look at them all together. And I think that's quite a good motto for asset management, which is we've got all these bits and they're all great, but it's only when you bring them together that you start really seeing, oh, that's a really good idea, that's not a good idea, oh, that doesn't fit with that, oh, that's what I should really be worrying about. So whole life cost models, I would start, if you don't have great historic data, just getting the right people around the table, like operations and maintenance, about looking at what we do at the moment, and you can start to put together a whole. I'm sure that you may not be entirely convinced by that, but it was the first time I ever did a whole life cost model back in, I don't know, about 2003, with somebody who knew the assets, you know, a subject matter expert on the ground. I always think that it took about 10 minutes to build a whole life cost model. It took the next 3 days to convince him that stop gibbering, that it couldn't be that easy. So it's really, think whole life cost models are about what do we do to our assets? And if you can describe what you do to your assets, you can turn that into a cost model. So, and they're so useful. I mean, if you ask me how do we use a whole life cost model, the answer will be everywhere once you have them. For all your decisions whole life, understanding that whole life cycle, and what's involved in every phase will be invaluable for making good decisions wherever they are.
Great. I do have another question for you, Ruth.
Wonderful.
And this is from Roxanne. Are there any resources for best practices or methodologies of how a small agency should perform asset management?
Well, that's a tricky question. Do you remember that I said that the single most useful resource for an asset management practitioner is other asset management practitioners? And I'm afraid that's sort of true. You can't learn it at college, and there's really very little published information on how to do asset management. The Institute of Asset Management does publish guides on how to do certain things. Some of them are more useful for small agencies than others. There's a very good New Zealand guide called the International, I should have put it on the list actually, International Infrastructure Management Manual, which was written in Australia and New Zealand, where including some very small agencies, very small councils, and really based on 30 years of experience of doing things like the asset management plan and the asset information. So that is a very good resource, but it kind of is head and shoulders above everything else. After that, there's not much else. Now, obviously, I have left this slightly accidentally on something which is at least might be a starting point if you're looking for actually what it needs to do to put in place an asset management team and an asset management program. But it's a funny world. Asset management really gets passed on between individuals. Somebody moving from one agency to another, going to conferences, being in networks. It's not really been captured. And there have been a few attempts in different countries to capture in guidebooks and manuals, but it's a funny business. I don't want to put you off, by the way, but I have to say that talking to other agencies is a very good place to start. You might look at the Institute of Asset Management website, and you can get a free copy of Building an Asset Management Team for what it's worth, which does talk about especially what you might do from scratch. So I'd love to hear from anybody else about other resources that they found very useful.
Right, we summarized one question here for you, Ruth. How is maintenance management understood in relationship to asset management?
Oh, this is a fascinating question. Because I was talking about this with some people in Australia this morning. Maintenance management has a longer history than asset management, and it's very tied with ideas about things like reliability engineering. So you start to see from a little bit before my time, from the 70s and 80s, you start to see maintainers looking at how do we do better maintenance. And out of that comes a really solid body of techniques and concepts. That feeds into asset management. When asset management is then starts in the early 90s, it picks up the thinking from maintenance management. However, it's a little bit complicated because people who weren't already aware of maintenance management can sometimes find themselves thinking about asset management without realizing that there's this body of knowledge going back that's very, very useful. So we do see people where they don't know about maintenance management and they don't know about reliability engineering, and they're missing a trick because they don't. If I ever teach somebody who's been on a reliability engineering course, for example, or usually if I'm teaching smart maintenance people, they don't really need asset management explaining to them because they get it. So how they fit together, I would say, if I was being really controversial, that I think too many organizations in North America and elsewhere don't pick up what they could of the kind of conceptual concepts and techniques that were developed in maintenance management. The one that everybody picks up is work management systems or enterprise asset management systems, but I'm not even sure that they're the most useful. I mean, I like work management systems, but there's some other things about thinking about failure and degradation curves that I take for granted in asset management, but not everybody knows them. So they should have a good, they're not the same thing, of course, because asset management isn't just about maintenance, but it has some of its roots in maintenance. And as I said, you never really have to explain to a maintenance person why asset management is important, why the life cycle is important, why it matters what those early decisions are. Because who is it who suffers? If you don't make good life cycle decisions, it's the maintainers. So that's a good subject, but that sounds like a subject I could talk about for a while. So.
And I just got this comment from Teresa Ray from Martha saying that for transit agencies, APTA has a series of recommended time practices that we try to draft for large or small scale agencies. So that's a good comment there from Teresa.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the FDA in Washington and other things like APTA have there's been quite a lot of work, quite a lot of networking and capturing best practice. Certainly, I mean, it's relevant obviously if you're transit, but I would think, I had never thought about that actually. I take it for granted when looking at transit, but it might be worth even other sectors looking at what the FTA, Federal Transportation Administration, and its networks have really drafted, because does everybody know that actually it's mandated, it's a legal requirement. If you want federal funding for transit, you must do asset management, and you must do something called a transit asset management plan. And that's meant that that sector has tried very hard to think about how to support not merely big agencies like New York or Atlanta, but also very small agencies. And I think of say small bus services, in rural bus services, they have to do asset management. So the rest of us have had to think, how do you scale it for very small agencies? And I think that would be a very good place to start. I have to say, talking to Teresa herself is also a very good start. Tap into that transit network, because, and I can give you some more details on that of who to talk to, that I think would be very good. Yeah, thank you for that.
And Ruth, I have a question here from Christopher asking, what is the typical time frame for ISO certification for a large utility company, say 1 billion in asset value over 1,000 employees?
I'm not sure that there's actually an answer to that. Usually ISO 55000 to certification will take you several years, but that's quite often because when you start out, you're not quite sure what you're doing. I mean, I have this feeling that if you had a very clear vision at the beginning, that's what you wanted to do, and you already had some things in place, which you will have. I think that actually some examples in America have done it quite fast. If you feel you really want to do it, it could be 2 or 3 years. There's quite a lot of things you have to think about in ISO 55000. All of them things you should think about, all the different processes that add up. But if you really knew what you were doing, I think 2, 3 years. You do have a requirement now that you have to have done it for a year, meaning you have to have your system in place for a year, basically, to show that it's not only just on paper, but it actually works in practice. And a good auditor for ISO 55000 will go and ask your people in the field how this all works. So it's a lot of it is to do with communication and actually trying it out. So let's say 3 years would be realistic if you knew what you were doing. I mean, people have sometimes spent longer doing it, but that seems reasonable to me. So, and again, you know what I'm going to say. Talk to the people like Teresa at MARTA, PG&E, New York Power Authority, the people who've actually done it, because they also have lessons learned. How, if they had their time again, what they would and wouldn't do. So I would say that would be a very good place to start. But you're going to get benefits from day one, though. Remember, you don't just wait until you've got the certification. From day one, you're starting to put in better processes, better thinking about decisions, better information strategy. You start to get the benefits very quickly. Okay.
And maybe, Ruth, we have maybe one more question.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine with me.
And this question is from Tejal asking, how do you explain and defend your asset management program and budget to the executive team?
Right. Well, that's a little, well, I probably won't finish it. I have to say, I mean, I don't mean to be completely corny. We do talk about what's the business case for asset management in building an asset management team. I think I should move the slide on so we don't keep looking at this as an advert for this. All right. But the issue of how to make the case, I have quite a strong feeling that it's not that difficult to sell the benefits. And one of the important things in selling it is to understand not only the benefits, but what work it actually takes and what commitment it actually requires. I know if we're very keen on asset management, we want to get it going, it's tempting to suggest that it's easier than it is. And it's tempting to worry about, what savings am I going to make on maintenance? I think that the benefits are pretty overwhelming when you talk to people about how much better organisations do when they're good at asset management and when they're not. The benefits are clear, but you also want the case to be realistic about what it's actually going to take and manage expectations, because you are changing people. If it could just be you putting in place the data and you putting in the tools, and it would be an easy thing to do, but it involves everybody, and that's why it takes real effort. So again, I'm happy to talk more about how you sell asset management to top management, but you do have to sell it to them. You want more than them just saying, okay, you can do it. Get on and do it, because it won't get the benefits unless they really are sold and really believe this is where their organisation needs to go. So it's worth thinking about it carefully. Do talk to me offline, because we can talk you through. There's some obvious things to say. So, any other questions or comments at this point?
We have a lot more, but those we can answer offline, of course. We ran out of time, but thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.